My name's Nate. I've camped at Lakeside a dozen times before, but something about that October night still twists in my gut whenever I think about it. The campground was near empty, and I'd planned a solo weekend for once. Just me, my old RV, and a pile of books. After weeks of city noise and endless meetings, I was ready for the silence. But I didn't realize silence could be so suffocating. It started that first night, just as I was settling in. I'd parked my RV close to the lake, a perfect view of the water glistening under the moonlight. I'd always loved that spot, surrounded by towering pines, with only the crackling of my small campfire breaking the stillness. But as darkness thickened, an unsettling chill crept over me. At around 10 p.m. I heard it, a faint rustling from the tree line about 20 feet away. Figuring it was just a critter, maybe a raccoon nosing around for scraps, I didn't think much of it. I'd handled all sorts of wildlife out here. But the noise kept up, steady, as if something was moving around my camp, just outside the glow of the fire. Curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed my flashlight, sweeping it over the trees. Nothing. Just branches swaying in the breeze, a few leaves skittering along the ground. But when I turned back to my RV, I saw it. Someone was standing by my campfire, their shadow stretching long and thin in the firelight. "Hey!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. But the figure didn't move. It was just there, as if carved out of the night itself. A silhouette with no face, no distinct features. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to approach, hoping it was just some fellow camper pulling a prank. But as I got closer, the figure melted into the shadows, disappearing as if it had never been there. I stood there, staring at the empty spot by the fire, my breath clouding in the cool air. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, I told myself. But as I sat back down, an uneasy feeling settled over me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. That night, sleep came in fits and starts, every small noise snapping me awake. A few times I thought I heard footsteps circling the RV, slow and deliberate. But every time I looked out the window, all I saw was darkness pressing against the glass. The next morning I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to nerves. I busied myself with a short hike, hoping the daylight would burn away the unease. But when I returned to the RV that afternoon, something strange caught my eye. There were small footprints around the fire pit, the kind you'd expect from a child, bare and pressed lightly into the dirt. But there were no families camping nearby, no signs of kids anywhere in the campground. I swallowed, a prickling chill crawling up my spine. The rational part of me tried to find an explanation. Maybe someone had stopped by while I was out. But deep down, I knew it didn't make sense. Night fell quickly, bringing with it a thick fog that blanketed the lake and the woods around me. The fire crackled as I sat outside, forcing myself to enjoy the peace and quiet, even as my nerves frayed. But then, just as I was beginning to relax, I heard it again. The rustling, closer this time, coming from all sides like whispers hidden in the trees. I flicked on my flashlight, heart hammering, and scanned the tree line. At first, there was nothing, just the fog swirling between the pines. But then, a movement, a dark shape darting between the trees too fast to make out any details. "Who's there?" I called, trying to sound braver than I felt. Silence. Only the crackle of the fire and the distant lap of water against the shore. But then, a voice, soft and childlike, drifted from the shadows. "Come play," the voice echoed, stretching out like it had nowhere else to go. I froze, my grip on the flashlight tightening. It was a girl's voice, faint but clear, as if she was just behind the trees. I took a shaky step back toward the RV, my mind racing. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here. Suddenly the figure appeared again, closer this time, just at the edge of the firelight. It was smaller now, almost child-sized, but its outline was blurry, like it was flickering in and out of reality. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, leaving me staring into the empty darkness. I bolted into the RV, locking the door behind me, my pulse pounding in my ears. I turned on every light, my fingers shaking as I fumbled with the switch. Outside, I could hear the footsteps again, circling, dragging, as if whatever was out there was pacing around the RV, waiting. The voice came again, softer now, right outside the window. "Come play." I backed away, pressing myself against the opposite wall, my mind spiraling. I knew I should leave, pack up and get the hell out of there. But I was paralyzed, trapped by a fear that felt ancient, rooted in some primal instinct to hide. I spent the rest of the night curled up in the corner, listening to the footsteps, the whispers. At one point I thought I heard scratching against the door, slow, deliberate, as if it was testing the lock. But dawn eventually broke, and with it, the noises faded, leaving only the chirping of birds and the distant hum of the lake. When I finally stepped outside, my legs shaky, I saw them, small handprints smeared in dirt across the RV door, and more of those footprints circling my campfire. I didn't stick around to investigate. I packed up as quickly as I could, heart pounding, throwing everything into the RV haphazardly before tearing down the trail, the campground shrinking in my rearview mirror. I haven't been back to Lakeside since. Part of me wants to prove to myself it was just a nightmare, a trick of the fog and shadows. But then I remember that voice, that small, ghostly whisper, and I know I'll never set foot in those woods again. My name's Matt, and looking back, I should have trusted my instincts about Dead Man's Point. I'd been RV camping with my best friend Leo for years, but something about that place didn't sit right with me from the start. We'd driven up the winding trails deep into the mountains, hoping for one last weekend adventure before the season turned. The campsite was isolated, more run down than we'd expected. The forest was dense, the air thick with the smell of damp earth, and a strange hush hung over everything. It wasn't the peaceful quiet we were used to. It felt stifling, like the whole place was holding its breath. We parked the RV in a clearing at the edge of the site. Leo cracked open a beer, laughing at my unease, but even he couldn't deny that the place had a strange vibe. The cabins scattered around looked long abandoned, and the old radio tower, a relic from who knows when, stood like a lone sentinel against the darkening sky. As the sun dipped, we set up a small fire and pulled out our battered radio. Out here, it was our lifeline, something we used to catch weather reports or, when we were lucky, a bit of music. But as I fiddled with the dials, all we got was static. Odd, given the nearby tower. I kept trying, twisting the knob, and finally, faintly, a voice broke through. "Turn back." I stopped, staring at Leo. The voice was distant, crackling through layers of static, but it was unmistakably there. "You hear that?" I asked, my voice a little too sharp. Leo shrugged, brushing it off. "Probably some old broadcast. Radio waves linger, right? Ghost signals or something." I wasn't convinced, but I forced myself to relax. We sat around the fire, talking, laughing, but my mind kept drifting back to the radio, the static that had sounded too much like a warning. By midnight, the air had turned biting cold, and an uneasy silence fell over the campsite, broken only by the occasional crackle from the fire. Just as we were about to head inside, the radio crackled to life again. This time, the voice was clearer, tinged with desperation. "Help. Please. I'm trapped." Leo and I froze, exchanging a glance. I picked up the radio, my fingers trembling, and tried to respond, but all I got was more static. I turned the dial, hoping to find the source, but the voice had vanished as quickly as it had come. Leo shook his head, trying to mask his own unease. Must be a prank, someone messing around with frequencies. But there was a tension in his voice, something he couldn't hide. I knew he felt it too, the wrongness of it all. We decided to pack it in for the night, but sleep didn't come easy. Every creak, every rustle outside made my skin prickle, and my thoughts kept returning to the voice. Around 3 a.m. I heard it again, Soft, muffled, but this time closer. The same voice calling out, "Help! Please!" I shook Leo awake, his eyes wide with panic as he strained to listen. We both sat in silence, the only sound the low hum of the wind against the RV. And then, the voice spoke again, clearer this time. "Deadman's Point. Don't leave me here." A chill crawled up my spine. There was no way it could have been a broadcast from outside the RV. The voice sounded like it was coming from inside the walls, as if someone was trapped, hidden in some impossible space. Leo grabbed the radio, shaking it, desperate to understand. "This has to be a joke," he muttered, more to himself than to me. But there was no laughter in his eyes, only fear. Suddenly the lights in the RV flickered, casting twisted shadows across the walls. The radio fell silent, leaving us in an oppressive quiet that felt almost tangible. I held my breath listening, but all I heard was the faint whistle of the wind. And then, just when I thought it was over, the voice came back. Louder, panicked. "Don't let them take me. They're here." The line went dead. The silence that followed was deafening, suffocating, as if the whole world had stopped. Leo and I were frozen, staring at each other, words lodged in our throats. We decided to leave. Whatever was happening, we didn't want any part of it. We threw our things together, scrambling in the darkness, desperate to escape. But just as we started the RV, a figure appeared in the headlights. A woman standing in the middle of the road, her face pale, eyes wide with terror. She didn't move, didn't react to the light. She just stood there, arms limp at her sides, staring at us with an intensity that chilled me to the core. Leo honked the horn, yelling for her to move, but she didn't budge. Slowly, she lifted her hand, pointing back toward the campsite, her lips moving silently, as if whispering something we couldn't hear. And then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she was gone. One moment she was there, and the next, the road was empty, the headlights illuminating only the trees swaying in the wind. We didn't stick around to question it. Leo floored the gas, the RV lurching forward as we tore down the mountain road, the campsite vanishing in the rearview mirror. The radio stayed silent the whole way back, the static replaced by an eerie calm that left us both on edge. When we finally reached the main road, Leo pulled over, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. Neither of us spoke. There were no words that could explain what we'd seen, what we'd heard. We just sat there, breathing, our hearts pounding in unison. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, in spirits trapped in places like Deadman's Point. But every now and then, when I'm driving late at night, I turn on the radio, hoping to hear a bit of static, a faint voice calling from the dark. And every time, I pray I won't hear anything at all. My name's Ben. I've always been one to chase solitude, but my weekend at Black Hollow Campground almost made me regret that. I'd read about the place online, a remote spot with hiking trails winding deep into old-growth forest. It was supposed to be scenic, quiet, the perfect place to unplug. But what those reviews didn't mention was the trail, one that seemed to pull you in, refusing to let go. I arrived late in the afternoon, parking my RV at the farthest spot from the entrance. The sun was already dipping, casting long shadows over the forest floor, and a heavy silence hung in the air. I shrugged off the chill creeping up my spine, figuring I was just spooked by the isolation. I set up camp and took a quick look around. A narrow trail led from the edge of my site, winding between the trees, beckoning. The campground map listed it as the Black Hollow Trail, notorious for being easy to lose if you weren't careful. As the sun slipped behind the trees, I decided to take a short walk, thinking I'd get back before dark. I packed a flashlight just in case, and started down the path. The forest was dense, thick with towering pines and heavy undergrowth, and I quickly found myself wrapped in a deep, echoing quiet. Each step seemed to echo back at me, as though the trees themselves were watching. After a while, I noticed small carvings on the trees, strange symbols, simple shapes scratched into the bark at regular intervals. At first, I thought they might be markers left by other hikers, but the farther I went, the stranger they became. Circles with slashes through them, spirals, lines forming geometric shapes. They looked almost ritualistic. I shook off a creeping sense of dread and turned to head back. But as I looked around, my heart skipped. The trail behind me was gone. The trees looked identical in every direction, and the path I'd just come down seemed to have vanished into the underbrush. "Stay calm," I muttered, forcing myself to breathe slowly. I'd read about this sort of thing. Forest trails could play tricks on you, especially as the light faded. But as I turned in circles, searching for any sign of the path, panic started to set in. Just then, a faint rustling broke the silence. I whipped around, shining my flashlight in the direction of the noise. Nothing. Only the shadows shifting as the light wavered. I took a cautious step forward, then another, listening for any sound, any indication of where I'd come from. And then I saw it. A piece of cloth snagged on a branch, fluttering slightly in the faint breeze. It was tattered and faded, a deep red that looked disturbingly like dried blood in the dim light. I reached for it, pulling it free, and noticed something etched into the tree next to it. A single word, scrawled in rough, jagged letters. "Help." My stomach twisted. It could have been a joke, graffiti from some bored camper, but it didn't feel like a joke. Not out here. Not when I was already lost. I shoved the cloth into my pocket and kept moving, hoping I'd stumble upon some sign of the campground. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. It was hard to tell. The trees closed in tighter, their branches clawing at my arms as I pushed through, and the light from my flashlight began to dim, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to shift and twist with every step. Finally, I stumbled into a small clearing. At the center was an old, decrepit tent, its fabric shredded and faded with age. I approached cautiously, my heart thundering as I lifted the edge of the tent flap. Inside were remnants of a campsite, an old sleeping bag, a rusted lantern, and a notebook lying open, pages yellowed and brittle. I picked it up, flipping through the pages. Most were blank, but on one of the last pages, scrawled in frantic handwriting, were the words, "If you find this, turn back." The trail. It doesn't end. It just takes you deeper. A chill ran through me, and I dropped the notebook, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I wanted to leave, to run back the way I'd come, but I was completely turned around, every tree looking like the last. I felt trapped, as if the forest had closed in around me, determined to keep me here. Then, from somewhere just beyond the clearing, I heard a voice, a faint whisper, almost childlike, calling my name. "Ben. Ben." My blood turned to ice. There was no way anyone could know my name out here. I'd told no one where I was going, not even my family. But the voice came again, soft, beckoning. "Ben, come play." I stumbled back, heart pounding, and turned to run, not caring about direction anymore, just desperate to escape. The trees whipped past me, branches clawing at my skin, and the voice followed, relentless, laughing, whispering, my name curling through the air like smoke. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually my flashlight flickered out, plunging me into darkness. I collapsed against a tree, my chest heaving, the silence around me so thick it felt like a weight pressing down. Then, just when I thought I'd lost it, a figure appeared ahead. A man, standing perfectly still in the shadows. His clothes were ragged, his face obscured, but his eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice low, gravelly, like it hadn't been used in years. I nodded, unable to speak, and he tilted his head, his gaze never leaving mine. "Once you're on this trail, you don't leave," he murmured. "It doesn't let you." He turned and vanished into the trees, leaving me alone in the suffocating dark. I tried to follow, hoping he'd lead me out, but he was gone, leaving no trace, no sound. By some miracle, just as dawn broke, I stumbled upon my RV. I must have wandered in circles for hours, but when I looked back, the The trail was gone, swallowed by the forest as if it had never existed. I didn't stay to question it. I drove out of Black Hollow Campground without looking back, the image of those strange symbols and that voice lingering in my mind. Even now, I can still hear it sometimes, soft, distant, calling my name. And I know deep down that part of me is still out there, lost on that vanishing trail, forever searching for a way back. My name's Ellie. My husband Tom and I were celebrating our 5th wedding anniversary with a weekend getaway at Creekside RV Park, a secluded spot near the edge of a quiet forest. We'd camped before, but never somewhere so far from the usual crowds. It felt peaceful, untouched. Just us, the trees, and the babbling creek nearby. The first night was calm. We sat by a small fire, sharing stories and laughing, the stars stretching across the sky like pinpoints of light. But as we settled in for the night, a feeling crept over me, a strange sense that we weren't alone. I brushed it off, convincing myself it was just nerves from being out in the middle of nowhere. Around midnight, I woke up to a soft tapping at the window next to our bed. Half asleep, I thought it was a branch scraping against the glass. But when I sat up, I realized the sound was deliberate, steady, rhythmic, like someone was knocking. "Tom," I whispered, nudging him awake. "Did you hear that?" He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Probably just an animal," he muttered, rolling over. I listened, my heart pounding, but the tapping had stopped. Trying to shake off the unease, I lay back down, telling myself it was nothing. The next morning I brushed it off, thinking maybe I'd imagined it. But that night, it happened again. Just as we were drifting off, the tapping started, louder this time. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. It was almost methodical. "Tom, wake up," I whispered, my voice trembling. He sighed, annoyed but curious now. He sat up, peering through the window. "There's nothing out there, Ellie. It's just the trees." But I could see he was uneasy too. The knocks were too precise, too human to ignore. We stayed up for a while, listening, but the knocking eventually stopped. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the RV made my skin crawl. By the 3rd night, Tom and I were both on edge. The tapping started earlier, just as we were settling into bed. I sat up, straining to listen, and this time, I could hear a faint whisper, like someone murmuring just outside. "Do you hear that?" I asked, gripping Tom's arm. He nodded, his face pale. We both listened, holding our breath. The whisper grew louder, but we couldn't make out any words. It was like someone was trying to speak through layers of static, their voice muffled and distant. Tom grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, determined to confront whoever, or whatever, was messing with us. I waited, heart racing, peering out the window as he scanned the area around the RV. "See anything?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. He shook his head, looking uneasy. "There's no one out here, but, Ellie, there are footprints." He motioned for me to come outside, and when I did, I saw them. Bare footprints, small and narrow, leading from the edge of the forest to our RV window and back. They looked fresh, the impressions deep in the soft dirt, but they ended abruptly just a few feet away, as if the person had vanished into thin air. We didn't sleep much that night, the two of us huddled in bed, listening to every tiny sound. The knocking returned, persistent and rhythmic, as if whoever was outside was waiting for us to answer. But neither of us dared move, too terrified to even look out the window. The next morning, we decided to cut our trip short. But as we were packing up, an older woman approached us from one of the nearby cabins. She had a worn face and eyes that held a strange sadness, as if she'd seen things she couldn't forget. "Leaving so soon?" she asked, her voice soft. I nodded, trying to be polite, but she must have seen the fear in my eyes. "You saw him, didn't you?" she asked, her expression turning grim. Tom and I exchanged a glance, not sure what to say. "The man by the window," she continued. "He visits anyone who stays here. Has for years. Some say he's a lost soul trapped between worlds. Others say he's just a shadow of something darker. I swallowed, my mouth dry. Who was he? The woman shook her head, glancing toward the forest. No one really knows. Some say he was a miner, back when these mountains were full of them. Others say he was a hunter, lost in a storm. But he's been here as long as anyone can remember. She paused, her gaze drifting back to us. The trick is, you can't acknowledge him. Don't answer the knocks. Don't try to see him. Once you do, he won't leave. A chill ran down my spine. We thanked her and hurried back to the RV, packing in tense silence. But just as we were about to leave, I felt it. A faint sense of someone watching us from the edge of the trees. I turned, half expecting to see a figure, but there was only shadow and silence. That night, even after we'd left Creekside far behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still with us. The memory of those knocks, that soft whisper, lingered, haunting me long after we'd returned home. It's been months since that trip, but sometimes, when I'm alone late at night, I still hear it. The soft, steady tapping at my window, as if he followed us back, waiting, patient as ever. And now I wonder if, somehow, acknowledging him that night was a mistake I can never undo. My name's Derek, and I've never been one to believe in ghost stories. But my weekend at Lost Pine Grounds changed that for good. It was supposed to be a reunion trip, me and a few old college buddies spending a couple of nights by the campfire, sharing drinks and laughs. We'd all camped before, but something about Lost Pine felt different, heavier. We arrived just before sunset, parking our RVs in a circle at the edge of the woods. The area was notorious for its spooky reputation. Stories about strange sightings and ghostly voices had been passed around for years. It was the perfect setting for a weekend of campfire tales, and we were all in high spirits as we gathered around, cracking open beers and sharing old stories. But then Dave, always the thrill-seeker, leaned forward, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. "Have you guys heard about the Whistler?" he asked, his voice low and conspiratorial. We all shook our heads, intrigued. I remember the way his face looked in the flickering light, almost too intense, like he was already wrapped up in the story he was about to tell. "They say he was a drifter who got lost in these woods a long time ago," Dave began. "No one knows exactly what happened, but he started losing his mind out here alone. Eventually, he stopped talking altogether. Just whistled. They say if you hear him whistle, it means he's watching you." There was an uneasy silence around the fire, everyone glancing at each other, half laughing but nervous. We all knew Dave loved a good scare, but something about this story felt different, darker. "Come on, man," I scoffed, trying to lighten the mood. "You're not actually buying into that stuff, are you?" But Dave just smiled, leaning closer. "You don't get it. The Whistler doesn't just stay in the story. You call his name, he comes looking for you. It's like a curse or something. People say that if you're brave enough to call him 3 times, he'll show himself. But once he finds you, he never leaves." I rolled my eyes, trying to play it cool, but I could feel the tension in the group. Everyone was a little on edge, the shadows around us feeling darker, the night quieter than usual. Dave stood up, his face lit by a mischievous grin. "I dare you guys," he said, his voice challenging. "Let's call him." "Seriously?" I asked, glancing around at the others. No one seemed eager to join, but Dave was already stepping away from the fire, his back to the woods. He looked over his shoulder, daring us to follow. Against my better judgment, I stood up, trying to act like I wasn't completely unnerved. One by one, the others joined, a reluctant circle forming around Dave, our backs to the warmth of the fire. Dave took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing. "Whistler. Whistler. Whistler," he called, his voice low but steady. For a moment there was nothing but the crackling of the fire behind us, the whisper of the wind through the trees. I let out a relieved breath, about to laugh it off, when I heard it. A faint whistle, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. I froze, my blood running cold. The whistle was soft, almost like a tune, but off-key, as if someone were trying to remember a melody and kept getting it wrong. The others heard it too, everyone exchanging uneasy glances. "Probably just the wind," someone muttered, but no one sounded convinced. The whistle grew louder, closer, each note sharp and deliberate, piercing the silence. I turned to Dave, expecting him to laugh, to say he'd set it up somehow. But he looked just as scared as the rest of us, his face pale. "Maybe we should get back to the fire," I whispered, not wanting to break the tension but desperate to feel the warmth of the flames. The others nodded, moving quickly, and we all sat down, huddling close, the fire our only comfort against the growing darkness. But the whistling didn't stop. It circled the campsite, weaving between the trees, growing louder and softer, as if whoever, or whatever, was making it, was moving around us, watching. I tried to laugh, to shake it off, but the sound caught in my throat. There was something too real about that whistle, too, focused. And as it circled, I started to feel like we weren't just being watched, we were being hunted. "All right, joke's over, Dave," I said, my voice a little too loud. But he just shook his head, wide-eyed, whispering, "I didn't do anything, man. I swear." Suddenly, the whistling stopped, plunging the night into a silence so thick it felt like cotton stuffed in my ears. I held my breath, waiting, heart pounding in my chest. Then, from the edge of the woods, a shadow stepped forward. It was tall, almost too tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch in unnatural ways. I couldn't see its face, just the outline against the trees, but I could feel it looking at us, a deep, unsettling gaze that made my skin crawl. The figure raised a hand slowly, deliberately, and pointed at us. The fire flickered, casting twisted shadows that made the figure seem to warp and stretch, its form shifting like smoke. "Whistler," it rasped, the voice dry, like dead leaves scraping across pavement. "You called." We didn't wait to find out what it wanted. We scrambled back, knocking over the chairs, stumbling over each other in a frantic rush to get to the RV. The door slammed behind us, and we huddled inside, peering out the window. But the shadow was gone. For hours, we sat in silence, too scared to move, the whistling lingering in our ears like a taunt. No one dared speak his name again, but we didn't sleep. Not even when dawn broke over the trees, casting the forest in an eerie, gray light. The next morning, as we packed up to leave, I looked back at the campsite, half expecting to see that figure standing there, watching us go. But it was empty, the fire pit cold, the trees silent. We never spoke about it after that. Maybe it was just the power of suggestion, the fear of the unknown that made us see things. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that whistle, drifting in through my window like a distant memory. And every time I wonder if calling his name that night was the worst mistake we ever made. My name's Jake, and I've always had a fascination with the paranormal. But until last month, I'd never truly believed in ghosts. That changed when I camped at Hollow Point. I'd read stories about the Lantern Keeper, a local legend of a man seen wandering the misty woods late at night, carrying a dim lantern that flickers like it's on the verge of going out. Some say he's searching for something. Others say he's warning people to stay away. I arrived at Hollow Point in the early evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The woods were thick, dense with mist that clung to the trees, giving everything a muted, otherworldly feel. I parked my RV at the edge of a clearing near the old trailhead, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Lantern Keeper. Skeptical but intrigued, I set up my camp, lit a small fire, and waited. By midnight, the fog had thickened, turning the world outside my fire's glow into a wall of shadows. I was beginning to think the legend was just that, a story. But then, as I stared into the mist, I saw it. A faint glow moving slowly between the trees, just beyond the clearing. My heart pounded as I squinted, trying to make out the shape. It was definitely a light, soft and flickering, almost as if it were struggling to stay alive. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped away from the fire, compelled to follow the glow as it drifted deeper into the woods. I knew I should have stayed by the fire, but something about that light drew me in, as if it held answers to questions I hadn't even asked. I moved carefully, my boots crunching over fallen leaves as I trailed the lantern, keeping just far enough to avoid startling whoever was holding it. As I got closer, I could make out a figure, a man, tall and thin, with a stooped posture, his back to me. He was holding the lantern in one hand, his other arm hanging limp by his side. His clothes were ragged, old-fashioned, like something out of a history book, and the dim light cast eerie shadows across his face, highlighting hollow eyes that stared straight ahead. I stopped, a shiver running down my spine. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't react, didn't turn. He just kept moving, slow and deliberate, as if drawn by something only he could see. I hesitated, debating whether to follow, but the pull was too strong, my curiosity overwhelming my fear. "Are you the lantern keeper?" I asked, taking a cautious step closer. This time, he paused. Slowly he turned his head, his eyes meeting mine. They were empty, dark hollows that seemed to swallow the light, and a chill swept over me, rooting me to the spot. His gaze felt ancient, haunted, as if he'd been wandering these woods for centuries, trapped in some endless search. "Leave," he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper, brittle as the autumn leaves underfoot. I took a step back, my heart racing, but then he turned away, lifting the lantern higher, and continued walking. Against all logic, I followed, too mesmerized to stop. The forest seemed to grow darker around us, the trees closing in as we moved deeper into the mist. After a few minutes, I noticed something strange. The ground beneath us was scattered with old rusted lanterns, each one cracked or broken, lying half buried in the dirt. They were scattered like offerings, remnants of those who'd come before, drawn by the same light. "Why are there so many lanterns?" I asked, more to myself than to him. He didn't answer. Instead, he stopped by an old withered tree, one that stood alone in a small clearing. The branches were twisted, bare, reaching out like skeletal hands, and at the base of the tree was a pile of stones, an unmarked grave. The lantern keeper knelt by the stones, his hand trembling as he placed his lantern at the foot of the grave. The light flickered, dimming almost to darkness, and in that moment I understood. He was bound here, tied to this spot, forced to search for something he'd never find. He looked up at me, his hollow eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it made my chest ache. "They took everything from me," he whispered, his voice cracking. "My family, my life. I've been searching, waiting." My throat tightened. I wanted to help him, to offer something, but I knew there was nothing I could do. His fate had been sealed long ago, and I was just a visitor, an intruder in his endless night. But then, he looked at me, his gaze intense, almost pleading. "Beware the lanterns," he said, his voice barely audible. "They lead you here, but they don't let you leave." A cold dread settled over me, and I took a step back, realizing too late what he meant. The rusted lanterns scattered across the ground. They weren't just relics. They were traps, markers of others who'd followed the light, only to become part of the lantern keeper's eternal vigil. I turned, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and ran, not caring about the noise, desperate to escape the creeping darkness. The fog thickened around me, the shadows shifting, twisting, as if they were alive, reaching out to pull me back. The lanterns flickered in the corners of my vision, each one calling out to me, whispering promises I couldn't quite hear. I stumbled, tripping over roots and rocks, the weight of the lantern keeper's gaze pressing down on me, urging me to stay. But I forced myself to keep moving, refusing to look back, even as the whispers grew louder, echoing in my mind. I didn't stop running until I burst into the clearing, my RV a blessed sight against the backdrop of the silent woods. I scrambled inside, locking the door, my heart pounding as I peered out the window. The fog lingered at the edge of the clearing, thick and impenetrable, But the lantern keeper was gone, his light swallowed by the night. I left Hollow Point the next morning, my hands still shaking as I gripped the wheel, refusing to look back. But even now I can feel it. The pull of that light, the weight of those empty eyes. And every now and then, when I close my eyes, I see a faint glow, flickering in the darkness, calling me back. They say the lantern keeper only shows himself to those who come seeking him. But I know better now. Once you see him, he never really lets you go. My name's Sam, and Timber Ridge was supposed to be just another stop on a long weekend road trip with my friend Eric. We'd parked the RV near the base of the ridge, planning a few days of hiking, grilling, and escaping the stress of our city lives. But our adventure took a turn the day we stumbled upon the lodge. It was tucked deep into the woods, barely visible from the trail, its faded, weather-worn exterior blending in with the surrounding pines. The building was massive, with dark, cracked windows and a sagging roof that gave it a forlorn, almost haunted look. "Check it out," Eric said, eyes gleaming with excitement. "How often do you get to explore a place like this?" I hesitated, something about the lodge setting my nerves on edge, but Eric was already moving toward it and I couldn't leave him to explore alone. Reluctantly, I followed, my stomach twisting with unease. The door creaked as we pushed it open, and we stepped inside. Dust hung thick in the air, swirling in the weak shafts of light that filtered through the broken windows. The lobby was eerily preserved, as if frozen in time. Chairs sat arranged in a circle around a cold fireplace, and faded paintings lined the walls, their subjects staring down at us with expressions that seemed almost watchful. "Creepy, huh?" Eric chuckled, breaking the silence. He sounded more curious than scared, like this was some sort of game. I forced a laugh, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruding, like the lodge was hiding something it didn't want us to see. We wandered through the rooms, taking in the decaying decor and peeling wallpaper, our footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Each room seemed untouched, as if its former guests had simply vanished, leaving everything behind. Tables were set with dusty plates, glasses half filled with murky liquid, and a suitcase lay open in the corner of one room, its contents spilling onto the floor. "Who would leave all this?" I muttered, running my fingers over a cracked mirror. Eric shrugged, more intrigued than concerned. Maybe they had to leave in a hurry. As we explored deeper into the lodge, I noticed small things that didn't make sense. Strange scratches along the walls, like someone had clawed at the wood, and symbols scrawled in faded ink on the doors. Odd patterns that made my skin prickle. We eventually found ourselves in the main hall, a grand open space with high ceilings and rows of darkened windows. A large chandelier hung overhead, swaying slightly, as if moved by some unseen breeze. The room was lined with chairs, all facing a stage at the far end, where a dusty piano sat, its keys cracked and yellowed. "Sam, check this out," Eric whispered, pointing to a small tattered book on one of the chairs. I picked it up, brushing off the dust, and realized it was a guest book, filled with names and dates. But the entries stopped abruptly in the 1980s, as if the lodge had been abandoned suddenly with no explanation. I flipped through the pages, my heart sinking as I read the last few entries. Words like "don't stay" and "beware the night" were scrawled in shaky handwriting, filling the margins with warnings that seemed desperate, almost panicked. "We should get out of here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. The eerie silence pressed down on me, a thick, suffocating weight. But Eric didn't seem fazed. "Oh, come on. It's just an old book. People write creepy stuff all the time to mess with people like us." Just then, the chandelier above us creaked, and I looked up, watching as it swayed more violently, the glass prisms casting strange shadows across the walls. I swallowed, gripping the book tightly, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But Eric, ever the explorer, was already moving toward the stage, his footsteps echoing through the empty hall. He knelt by the piano, running his fingers over the keys, a faint, discordant sound filling the air. "Eric," I called, a shiver running down my spine. "Let's go, now." He sighed, rolling his eyes but finally standing up. Just as we turned to leave, A loud bang echoed through the hall. We froze, staring at each other, wide-eyed. "Probably just the wind," Eric whispered, though he didn't sound convinced. We hurried back through the hall, but as we passed the guest rooms, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Each door we'd left open was now shut, as if someone or something had been following behind, closing them one by one. I tried to keep calm, but my heart was pounding, my skin prickling with fear. Eric looked at me, his face pale, and I could tell he was finally starting to feel the same dread that had gripped me since we'd entered. We made our way to the lobby, our footsteps quickening, but as we reached the entrance, we stopped short. The door, the one we'd left wide open, was now shut, and no amount of pushing or pulling could budge it. "We're locked in," I whispered, panic bubbling up in my chest. Eric shook his head, his usual bravado gone. "There has to be another way out. Let's check the windows." We moved quickly, checking each window, but everyone was jammed, the frames warped and rusted shut. It was as if the lodge itself had decided to trap us inside. "Sam, look," Eric whispered, pointing to the far end of the lobby. There, standing in the doorway of one of the guest rooms, was a figure, a tall, thin silhouette, watching us with dark, empty eyes. We stumbled back, our hearts racing, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, its gaze fixed on us, unblinking, almost as if it were waiting. Without a word, we bolted down the hallway, desperate to find another exit. Every door we tried was locked, the hallways stretching and twisting as if the lodge were shifting, leading us deeper into its maze. Finally, we reached a small, dusty stairwell that led down to the basement. It was our only option, and we didn't hesitate, practically tripping over ourselves as we descended into the darkness. The basement was cold, damp, the walls lined with old rotting furniture and crates covered in cobwebs. The air was thick, stifling, and I could barely see in front of me as we stumbled forward, searching for any way out. Then, I saw it, a door at the end of the room, partially open, revealing a faint sliver of light. We ran toward it, hope surging in my chest, but as we reached the door, it slammed shut, leaving us in pitch darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking, and flicked it on. But when the beam hit the wall, I froze, my heart plummeting. There, scratched into the wall, was a single word: "Stay." Eric grabbed my arm, pulling me back, his face twisted in terror. "We have to get out of here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. We turned, moving blindly through the basement, our breaths echoing in the suffocating silence. But no matter which way we turned, we ended up back at that same door, that same word etched into the wall, mocking us. Eventually, we found ourselves back in the main hall, the lobby quiet, the front door somehow open. We didn't question it. We ran, stumbling into the daylight, the cold air a shock against our faces. We didn't look back as we reached the RV, slamming the door behind us, the lodge shrinking in the rearview mirror as we sped away. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can still see it, the figure in the doorway, watching, waiting. And I know that if I ever return to Timber Ridge, it'll be waiting for me, ready to close the door once again. My name's Sarah, and if I'd known what was waiting for us at Echo Lake, I would have never taken my family there. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. Just me, my husband Mark, and our 2 kids, Tyler and Emma. We'd rented an RV and planned a few days by the lake, fishing, hiking, and enjoying the quiet. We arrived just before dusk, the lake shrouded in a light fog that gave everything an eerie, dreamlike quality. The campsite was empty, not a single other camper in sight, which I found odd for a weekend. Still, we were thrilled to have the place to ourselves, and we quickly set up camp, planning to spend the evening around a small fire. As night fell, the fog thickened, curling around us like something alive. I was roasting marshmallows with Emma when she suddenly stopped, her eyes fixed on the edge of the lake. "Mom, look," she whispered, pointing toward the water. At first I didn't see anything, but then I noticed a figure standing on the opposite shore. It was hard to make out through the fog, just a tall, dark silhouette that seemed too still, too focused on us. "Probably just a hiker," I said, trying to sound reassuring. But deep down, I felt a chill. The figure hadn't moved once since we'd noticed it, standing perfectly still, as if watching us. Mark joined us, squinting across the lake, and I could see the unease in his eyes. "Let's get inside," he said, his voice firm. I didn't argue, and we quickly put out the fire, huddling inside the RV as the fog pressed against the windows. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought of that figure standing by the lake, its shape burned into my mind. Around 2 a.m. I finally got up, peering through the window, hoping to see nothing but darkness. But there it was, the figure, closer this time, standing just beyond our campsite, its shadow stretching toward us in the moonlight. I gasped, waking Mark, who joined me at the window. "It's probably just someone camping nearby," he whispered. But his face was pale, his voice strained. We tried to go back to sleep, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming, every creak of the RV making my heart race. The hours dragged on, and by morning I was exhausted, a dull headache pounding behind my eyes. The next day, we tried to enjoy ourselves, taking the kids down to the lake, fishing, hiking, doing anything to shake off the night's unease. But as evening approached, I noticed something strange. More figures, scattered around the lake, standing just at the edge of the trees. Each one was different. Some tall, others short, their shapes vague and shadowy in the fading light. They stood in silence, unmoving, all facing our campsite. Mark noticed them too, his face tightening as he took my hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Let's keep the fire going tonight," he said quietly, and I nodded, trying to keep calm for the kids. As night fell, the figures seemed to move closer, drifting silently through the fog, their shapes growing more defined with each hour. I could make out details now: dark clothes, hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light, their faces blank and expressionless. They stood just beyond the firelight, a ring of silent watchers, their eyes locked on us. "Mom, who are they?" Tyler whispered, clutching my arm. "I don't know, honey," I murmured, pulling him close. "But don't worry, we're safe here." But I didn't believe my own words. The figures felt wrong, like they weren't fully there, their forms shifting slightly, as if they were made of mist. Mark threw more wood on the fire, his eyes darting between the figures as he tried to keep his composure. Around midnight, the fog thickened, swallowing the light until it felt like we were floating in a sea of shadows. The figures drifted closer, circling us, their hollow eyes unblinking. I could feel their gaze, a cold, invasive presence that sent chills through me. "We need to leave," I whispered, my voice shaking. Mark nodded, and we quickly gathered the kids, hurrying inside the RV. But just as I shut the door, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing inches away, its face pressed against the window, watching us with empty eyes. I yanked the curtain shut, heart pounding as I tried to steady my breathing. We spent the rest of the night huddled in silence, listening to the faint tapping on the windows, like fingers brushing against the glass. It was soft, almost gentle, but it was relentless, a steady reminder that we weren't alone. At dawn, the tapping stopped, and when we finally dared to look outside, the figures were gone, leaving only the fog and an eerie silence. Mark and I exchanged a glance, unspoken understanding passing between us. We weren't staying another night. We packed up quickly, eager to leave, but as we started the RV, the engine sputtered, refusing to turn over. Panic flared, and Mark tried again and again, but the RV remained stubbornly silent, as if something were holding it in place. Come on," he muttered, his voice rising with each failed attempt. Just then, Tyler let out a small gasp, pointing toward the edge of the trees. The figures were back, standing in a perfect line along the shoreline, closer than ever. Their faces were more defined now, pale, almost translucent, with eyes that held an unnatural, hollow darkness. They don't want us to leave, Emma whispered, clutching my hand. I tried to calm her, but fear had lodged itself deep in my chest. The figures began moving toward us, slow and deliberate, their feet barely touching the ground. I could hear a faint whispering now, a murmur of voices that grew louder as they approached. Mark gave the engine one last desperate try, and finally it roared to life. He didn't hesitate, flooring the gas as we lurched forward, the figures disappearing into the fog as we sped down the dirt road, the lake shrinking in the rearview mirror. We drove in silence, each of us too shaken to speak. But just as we reached the main road, I glanced out the window and felt my blood turn to ice. Standing at the edge of the tree line was a single figure, watching us as we drove away, its hollow eyes following us until we were out of sight. Even now, weeks later, I still feel that gaze, cold and unrelenting. And every night, when the house is quiet, I hear it. The soft tapping at the window, a faint whisper carried on the wind, as if they're waiting for us to return to Echo Lake.